Thanks. So I look a bit ill-prepared. That's because I'm on holiday here in Austria, but I think it should be fine. Let's get this going. So I think the introduction was great. That already covers most of what I want to say. So my interest in machine learning is born out of necessity rather than sort of. So it's something that helps us do our chemistry research rather than being front and center. And so my research group focuses on looking at metal organic interfaces, so chemical reaction dynamics, spectroscopy on such interfaces. And the problems can be quite diverse. So for example, we're interested in looking at single molecule chemistry, nanotechnology, and manipulation of such metal organic interfaces. But we're also interested in ultra-fast energy transfer surface spectroscopy, so looking at ultra-fast dynamics on the femtosecond, picosecond scale, and how energy flows between organic molecules and metal nanostructures. And a big topic at the moment is photochemistry. So we're interested in studying how light actually activates chemical dynamics and how light, electrons, and atoms at metal organic interfaces can drive chemical reactions. And all of these things we want to do with ab initio methods, so with electronic structure theory, which is exactly why machine learning is interesting, because it helps us to speed up some of the things we need. And so because we're interested in chemical dynamics, we're performing molecular dynamics and quantum dynamic simulations, and the dynamic reactions of molecules and surfaces can be quite complicated. So it's more than just overcoming a transition, an activation barrier. It's all about complex dynamics and entrance channels and having the right initial conditions. So we need to perform lots of different molecular dynamic simulations to understand the right conditions that give rise to chemical reactions of large and small organic molecules. And especially because it's a metal surfaces, the ingredients we need to do this are quite interesting. So obviously, first of all, we need to capture the electronic structure. So we need to perform quantum chemistry calculations that capture the molecular energy levels, but also the density of state, the electronic states of the metal, and get the right energy landscape and forces that act on the molecules. We also need to account for energy dissipation effects, so energy transfer between molecule and surface as the molecule, pinches on the surface and interacts with it. And that can be via vibrational energy exchange, but it can also be by exciting electronic excitations in the metal or in the molecule. And so these are non-adiabatic effects. And that's particularly interesting in the context of light-matter interaction. So if light excites electrons, and these electrons drive chemical reactions on these surfaces. And of course, that can lead to quantum dynamics. So the fact that there are coherent changes in the dynamics of the molecule on the surface. And so if we want to capture all of these things, it's very hard to do this with on-the-fly dynamics. So calculating quantum chemistry at each and every time step during molecular dynamics or quantum dynamic simulations. And this is where machine learning comes in for us. So if we look at molecular dynamics, right, we want to propagate the system as a function of time. So in each and every time step, we're propagating some equation of motion to, for example, update the geometry, how it changes, update how the momenta change, and other properties at each and every time step. So for example, in classical MD, we would have to calculate the energy and the force acting on the atoms at each and every step along the trajectory. And we would do this using, for example, density function theory or some wave function based method, some quantum chemistry method. And that's of course expensive. And this is where machine learning is already very well established as a method to construct force fields and interatomic potentials to give us ab initio type accuracy, but at the cost of force fields. So we use machine learning to map atomic coordinate and elemental composition onto some energy function as a function of coordinates. If we look at non-abiotic molecular dynamics, so for example, photochemistry simulations, we need more ingredients to do the dynamics, right? In addition to the ground state energy, we need excited state energy. So several different energy levels that depend on the wave function. And we need couplings between these energy levels. So how do the nuclear positions make electronic states talk to each other? And all of these ingredients are necessary to perform, for example, surface hopping dynamic simulations. So we now would need machine learning models for different energy levels. And we would also need some models for these coupling vectors that tell us when an electron jumps from one state to another. And so this is also something that needs to be established. And only very recently has some work been done on this topic in the last 2 years. And if we go even beyond that, if we want to propagate the full quantum dynamics of a system, so we want to propagate the density matrix or a wave packet, we basically need to follow the density matrix and the Hamiltonian of the system as a function of time. And so ideally, we would want to be able to predict the Hamiltonian at each and every time step, right? So that means, ideally, we want the machine learning model of the full Hamiltonian of the system. And once we have that, we can, of course, diagonalize the Hamiltonian, we get energy levels and couplings, and all the other things fall out of it because of how quantum mechanical expectation values work. If there is an operator that describes a property you want to measure, and you have the wave functions and you have the Hamiltonian, then you can calculate that observable, right? So a machine of the Hamiltonian kind of gives us everything in one model. That's the idea. And this is why we're interested in looking at machine learning regression models, interpolation models that go beyond energy landscapes. And so one of the first models we've looked at was a machine learning model to predict orbital energies and molecular wave functions. So we were interested in being able to predict DFT energy levels, Hartree-Fock energy levels, and molecular orbitals. And the way how we did this is there's a collaboration with colleagues at the TU Berlin in the group of Klaus-Robert Müller. And the model is called SNORP for orbitals. And SNET is a convolutional neural network. So it's a deep learning infrastructure that takes the elemental composition, so what type of elements each atom has in the system, and the corresponding Cartesian coordinates. And it takes those in and through many layers tries to capture the atomic environment of each atom, and then it gives you a prediction, right? And in our case, we extended this to also look at pairwise interactions, and the output of that model is a big matrix, and that matrix is the Hamiltonian in local orbital representation. So for example, for the H2O molecule, the model predicts all of these matrix elements here that correspond to the interactions of different orbitals with each other. So a 1s orbital interacting with a 2s orbital on oxygen, or a hydrogen interacting with oxygen, and so on. And we predict the Hamiltonian and the overlap matrix in this local orbital representation. And when you then diagonalize this, you get the energy levels and the molecular wave functions. And the model captures all of the important properties of these molecular wave functions. For example, if we construct a machine learning model for water, so we basically, as our training data are the molecular coordinates and the corresponding energy levels and wave functions of the molecule. We train on these to construct these Hamiltonians. And when we, for example, then rotate the water molecule rigidly, we can see that the orbitals we predict rotate with the molecule as they should. And we capture this rotational equivariance by training the molecule, by rotating it a lot of different times and modifying the orbitals with it. And we can do that because we know the algebra associated with this rotation. And since we've published this actually just, I think, a few weeks ago, an update of this model came out that actually shows that you can encode all these symmetries right within the model. You don't need to do this with data augmentation. In any case, you can trust me that we can predict these energy levels and orbitals as we should. And we can look at the performance of this model. For example, we train a model on the ethanol molecule. So we train on molecular dynamics data, ethanol in various different configurations. And on the graph here, I hope you can see my mouse, you can see the mean absolute error prediction on the orbital energies. So the first 13 here would be the occupied energy levels up to the HOMO, highest occupied molecular orbital. 14 upwards would be the unoccupied states, so lowest unoccupied molecular orbital upwards. And you can see that the errors are quite different. So we are in the milli-EV error for occupied states and at about tens of milli-EV error for the unoccupied states. And this is because unoccupied states are a bit harder to learn. They have more angular momentum components, more nodal planes. They're also not strictly bound by the equations, right? They don't enter the density, so they're not variationally optimized to the same threshold as the occupied states. But for a given geometry here on the right, you can see we get the energy levels with respect to the reference quite well. In the unoccupied cases, you can see there's a slight deviation. And the molecular orbitals we can predict are actually almost perfectly on top of the reference. You can see here in the LUMO +2, there's a slight variation in the coefficients if you look very closely. But with this model now, we can, for example, follow molecular dynamics run and predict the orbitals at each point. So here we're plotting the, I think this is a HOMO -2 for the hydrogen, intramolecular hydrogen transfer of malon dialdehyde from the left oxygen to the right oxygen. And you can see the orbital basically perfectly represents this, the model perfectly represents the orbitals compared to the reference. Right, so what can you do with such a model now? Well, the first thing we can do is we took quantum mechanics data, we took this data from an ORCA calculation, DFT, Hartree-Fock, and we construct the machine learning model from this training data. But we can now take the training data and feed it right back into quantum mechanics because it has the same representation that quantum mechanics codes, quantum chemistry codes understand, local atomic orbitals. And so, for example, we can use this Schnorr model to generate a wave function guess for a DFT calculation. Typically in DFT calculations, you have multiple SCF steps you need to do to iterate the equations, converged equations. And the guesses are either random guesses or Höckel theory-based guesses, but we can use our machine learning model as guess. And if we do this right, we can actually see we can significantly reduce the number of steps necessary if we restart from this Schnorr model. Now, the thing is, most quantum chemistry codes use very conservative wave function guesses and very conservative algorithms because the guesses are typically quite bad. But if we take an algorithm, for example, a Newton-Raphson type quadratic algorithm, that would typically not even converge for a normal wave function guess, with our sophisticated guess, we can boil it down to about 4 steps rather than the 17 to 18 steps we typically use for molecules. And this is here for the Euroscale molecule. We can also use the wave function as input for correlation, for correlated post-Hartree-Fock theories. So we can use this to calculate MP2 energies or Hartree-Fock energies, which are the first order and second order perturbation theory results on top of these energy levels. Another thing we can do is, because we have the Hamiltonian and in local basis representation, is we can do bonded charge analysis. So we can calculate the density matrix, look at the charge that correspond to dynamics run. For example, if you look again at malon dialdehyde molecule, where the hydrogen transfers from oxygen 1 to oxygen 2, we can follow how the bond or the bond breaks between hydrogen and oxygen 1 and how it is established between hydrogen and oxygen 2. And you can see reference and a model prediction are quite close to each other here. Let me just look at the time. All right, I'm going to move over this. We can also do some other inverse design tricks because our wave function is an analytical representation of the wave function. So the model is differentiable now, which means any property that's based on the wave function that we can calculate from it is also differentiable. And we can ask some interesting questions. For example, what is the structure associated with some optimized property? For example, can you give me the structure that gives me the highest or lowest possible homo-lumo gap? And that we can do with this model because we have these gradients that we can calculate based on the machine learning predicted property with this, and the gradient with respect to atomic displacements. So the model that I've just talked about is such that for each and every molecule, we have one model, right? So we basically train on ab initio data for a given molecule like ethanol or malon dialdehyde, and then we predict the machine learning model for that. Recently, thanks to a new postdoc in my group, Julia, we now have an adaptation of this machine learning model for many molecules. So we have one model for pretty much all organic molecules now. And we do this slightly differently. So we don't learn the Hamiltonian in its local atomic orbital Gaussian wave function basis, but we let the machine learning model pick the basis. So we basically have a deep convolutional network that at the end of it gets a matrix, a Hamiltonian, and the model gets to populate the matrix however it wants. We don't tell it any properties of that matrix except that it needs to be Hamiltonian. So it needs to be emission And if you diagonalize it, it needs to give us the energy levels. So the model builds an internal Hamiltonian representation, and the output of this pipeline are the electronic energy levels we want to predict. And that's all. And so if we do this, we can, for example, for the H2O case again, we can predict all energy levels that we need. And we're doing a lot better than any other possible model we can come up with. For example, we could obviously do trivial models where we train a separate model for each energy level. So the HOMO gets its own model, the LUMO gets its own model. And that of course works, but then you need to train as many machine learning models as you have energy levels. So that's not really sensible. If you do a trivial vector type model where you try to get rid of this Hamiltonian, you just predict the vector of energy levels, you get quite a lot of noise. So the red points here would be this trivial vector prediction, which is not working so well. And you can see our pseudo Hamiltonian model here actually is much more accurate. So the correlation between the ML prediction and the reference is quite good. And so we can train this now on a data set of a variety of different molecules. And we've tested a couple of data sets. The one I'll talk about is this OE62 database. It's quite an interesting database. So it's relatively large organic molecules that are chemically quite diverse. You can see loads of different elements in there, up to 174 atoms. So there's 60,002 different molecules that are in principle crystal forming. So they're from the Cambridge Crystal Structure database. And for each of these molecules, we have the hybrid DFT level cone-sham energy levels. For a random half subset, half the data, for a subset, we have the same energy levels with water solvation, implicit water solvation. And for a very small subset, about 5,000 data points, we even have many-body perturbation theory correlation energies. So these are corrections on top of the DFT energy levels that accurately represent electron addition and electron removal energies, so ionization potentials and electron affinities, that you can actually compare to experiment. So what do we get if we train on this data set? So we train on about 40,000, 50,000 data points of this data set. And you can see on the x-axis, we have the energy level prediction with the ML model. On the y-axis, we have the reference, and we get a correlation. So the model does predict something. At the lower end of these energy levels, we can see it's trailing off. So there's some higher error in these points. And all of these points are associated with a single molecule, by the way, which is really weird. If you look at this thing, this is like a cube of nitrogen atoms with lots of bulky spacer group. So this is a really weird molecule that we're not really getting right with our model. While for the others, for example, we're doing a relatively good job here. So I told you this database is interesting. It has 62,000 molecule entries for which we have these hybrid DFT energies. It also has these 5,000 data points with very accurate energy levels. And for example, we can now add on top of our model a delta machine learning model where we only learn the difference between DFT and GW. And it turns out if you learn this difference, this is actually very easy to learn, much easier than to learn the original data. And so you can see this delta ML model on top of the DFT data now opens up the band gap. So the unoccupied states are high in energy, the occupied ones are lower in energy, to better reflect the correlation that and the underestimation of DFT band gaps. We can do the same for the solvation data, but it's less interesting. And that not much is happening in terms of implicit solvation to the energy levels. But the models actually give quite a nice prediction. If we take a single molecule out of this one here on the bottom right, and we just plot the energy levels on a spectrum, we can see that the ML prediction for this GW correlation data and the corresponding reference is pretty much on top of each other. You can see we're missing this wiggle here, but otherwise the spectra are quite well represented. So now we have a machine learning model that can predict the energy levels quite accurately for a wide variety of different organic molecules. And we want to test this independently. So we want to validate the data on molecules that we certainly have not in our training database. Because if you only look at molecules that are in your training set or in the train test split, you might have a biased view of the accuracy. And so what I'm showing you here now are 4 different molecules, all of which are not part of the database. And in fact, the chemical structures are very different. So for example, this 5-ring, 7-ring structure doesn't appear in the database in any form. or this condensed four-ring structure. So these are unseen molecules for the model, and we can predict the hybrid energy levels, but also these GW energy levels, and they compare very well to experiments. So these experimental spectra here, we can see we get the position and actually the intensity of these peaks quite reasonably right. And this is, of course, exciting because it means our model can in principle be used to predict photoemission spectra, inverse photoemission spectra. We also are pretty sure we can do X-ray photoemission. And it's quite useful for high throughput screening because at no point do we need to make any DFT calculations anymore. We can predict the hybrid DFT energy levels with the model. And on top of that, we predict the many-body correlation energy. And we're now working on extending this to materials and surfaces. Right, and that's about everything I wanted to cover. So I talked to you about the molecular wave function prediction that we're trialing, and we're using this to construct effective Hamiltonians for dynamics, and the machine learning model for electronic spectroscopy that we've built as part of our effort to facilitate the quantum dynamics, non-abiotic dynamic simulations we want to do. And so I need to thank my group members and our collaborators from Berlin, and of course funding and CPU time. Thanks.